Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the presentation on the Lamy Railroad with Fred Friedman. I'm Melanie McWhorter, the Development Coordinator for Historic Santa Fe Foundation. Historic Santa Fe Foundation is located in Santa Fe, New Mexico, for those of you who don't know, and on Historic Canyon Road. The offices, Salon and Garden, are now open from Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 p.m. We do actually have an opening coming up on July 2nd with Celia Owens, one of our artists in residence. So we would welcome you to join us for that. The masks are required indoors, but not in the garden. So our events like this one are listed on our website, and it's historicsantafe.org. We're a member-based organization. The Salon talks are free for members, and so some of you who paid to attend today, you're welcome to email me at melanie@historicsantafe.org to find out if you want to find out more about membership. So join us and sign up for our email list on our website so you can find out about more events that are coming up. You'll be joining us today without audio or video, so we ask you to post the questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can afterwards. This talk is about an hour, so it's a little longer than we usually host, so we'll try and get to as many questions as we can afterwards. Our speaker today, Fred Friedman, served for 30 years as head of the New Mexico Transportation Department's Railroad Bureau, addressing all facets of freight and passenger railroad activities within the state. Upon retirement, he worked as a railroad accident investigator and expert witness in related cases for various law firms throughout the country. Friedman is presently a board member of the Historical Society of New Mexico, and he writes and lectures about territorial and state railroads in the Land of Enchantment. So we're delighted to have you here today, Fred. Welcome.
Melanie, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, and this particular subject is something that I've had a love affair with for several decades, and I hope those of you that are listening will share that enthusiasm at the conclusion of this talk. The subject of the presentation, as you well know, is the Lamy Branch Line. That's the line of rail that runs south from the rail yard in downtown Santa Fe for a distance of about 18 miles to the community of Lamy. I've walked that line, as I suspect many of you have, about 4 times. The first few times I did it, I was fortunate enough that the legal tender was open, and that was always a welcome place to relax and refresh afterwards. There are 2 things that are really overarching characteristics of the Lamy Branch Line. Number one is that try to bear in mind as we go through some of these slides and some of these topics that the line is really a microcosm of New Mexico's railroading past. It's not only a microcosm of railroading, but it also reflects cultural attitudes and cultural desires for rail during the 19th and 20th century. The other element that's really interesting about this particular rail, as opposed to other tracks in New Mexico, is that it has a mysterious phoenix-like quality about it, in that on several occasions it has literally arisen from its own ashes. And with its recent purchase this past May, it appears that it's going to do that again. I think that's fantastic that this little line keeps reinventing itself. And with that, we can go ahead and start. This is an overview of the presentation. If we're clicking along at a decent rate, I won't stop for a break and we can keep going, but this will give you an idea of what we're going to be talking about. The first part is really how the line got started. It was an afterthought to begin with, and people in Santa Fe were successful in convincing the corporate interests that were building through New Mexico to come up to Santa Fe. The last half of the talk is about changing times for railroads in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and 90s, and the effects that that had on the line. After that, we'll do some questions. This is just a diagram to really illustrate how the line was and continues to be a microcosm of New Mexico railroading history. There were all of these events that were going on in the late 1880s and the early 1900s. And they include the federal expansionist laws, such as the Pacific Railway Act, the Dawes Act, a number of others. There was territorial legislation that essentially mirrored the federal legislation and supported it. The line took us through the Fred Harvey era and the great trains, the El Capitan, the Super Chief, and other trains that didn't stop in Santa Fe, but stopped at Lamy. And there were a number of other issues, such as the world wars, local politics, natural interests, and fallen flags. Fallen flags refers to corporate railroad companies that did exist at one time, had a connection with the Lamy Branch and the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, and for a variety of reasons no longer exist. There are a couple of themes on this presentation, and if you bear these in mind, I think you'll see the connection between the various phases and elements of railroading, and in particular of the Lamy Branch. To begin with, railroads in the 1880s changed absolutely everything, from legislation to laws to the way people did things, jobs, and everything else. So railroads, it can be said, were the space program of the 1880s. Everybody wanted a railroad if you lived in a small town. With it, you generally succeeded. Without it, you didn't. Railroads were profit-driven. The owners and the supervisors were focused on returning investment dividends to their investors, and they were very focused on that. It's important to focus on some of the railroad names. For example, there were 3 Santa Fe Southern railroads in this area historically, and we'll talk about that as we go along too. This is a map of the branch line, starting up at the rail yards near Tomasitas. It runs for 18.1 miles to the south and connects at Lamy, formerly known as Galisteo Junction. The line's 141 years old. Its width is about, it varies in places, 200 feet either side of a center line. It's comparatively light rail compared to what we have today. And there's a ruling grade of just under 3%. That means that within every 100 feet, the line will go up about 3 feet. There are a number of bridges, there are a number of curves on the line. All of this is important because it goes directly to the cost of maintenance of this line. With 19 bridges, 55 curves, and relatively light rail, it's in need of constant maintenance. That makes it expensive. That's one reason why the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway Company in 1991 decided to get rid of the line. We'll go into that as well. But there are some safety issues, and while there is a rail trail adjacent to the line, that is highly unusual in the context of other operating railroads, simply because the liability of somebody getting hurt is increased significantly with an adjacent rail line and walking path being right next to one another. There is a requirement for a portion of this line to adhere to a federal requirement called positive train control, and I will get into that shortly as well. But there are a number of issues that are associated with the line. Makes it safe, makes it more expensive, also makes it much more interesting. In the 1880s, the territorial capital of New Mexico was undergoing some change. The Santa Fe Trail had been in existence for about 50 years at that point. Those freight volumes were beginning to decline. The Santa Fe Railway Company and other companies noticed that. Santa Fe also, as it is today, is generally isolated. There isn't a lot of production here, nor was there in the 1880s. It's also important to note that the states all around us, Utah, Colorado, Texas, even Arizona, all had railroads. New Mexico didn't, and even by 1878, when the first train came into New Mexico from Colorado, it arrived here relatively late. In response to the indifference of the railroad coming through the territory of New Mexico and poised at the top of Raton Pass, a railroad committee was established, and it had a lot of influence on the railroad itself. This is an image of manifest destiny, and some of you may recognize it from your civics or history high school classes. But that woman depicted in the image is manifest destiny herself. And you can see her leading covered wagons, stagecoaches, miners with picks and shovels. And behind her is a locomotive, somewhat in the distance. The Santa Fe Railway Company had a different image of manifest destiny. And in their mind, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway Company were really a team of horses pulling Uncle Sam seated in the back, and below them on a railroad from the Missouri River to the setting sun in the Pacific Ocean stretched the rest of the country that was going to be populated and enhanced economically by the railroads. There were some early railroad surveys that had a lot to do with the Lamy Branch's development. They included the Illinois Central Railroad, the Pacific Railroad surveys. There were literally dozens of them. And even surveying these rail lines wasn't an easy job. You can see from the gentleman on the left that these were heavy instruments that they carried, and they did it by hand. They walked the entire way, and they had fragile instruments that they had to carry over rivers and through canyons. So it was quite an undertaking just to lay out the line. There was some national legislation that was tied to railroad development, principally at the insistence of local politicians that wanted to see the development of manifest destiny and were looking for new markets for goods that they were manufacturing, primarily in the Midwest and in the eastern states. Important piece of legislation, and this also relates to the Lamy Line, was the Pacific Railway Act. That act was revised subsequently during the Civil War. It was eventually signed by President Lincoln, and it had a number of admonishments in it. One was to build to California and Mexico. The other was to form a transcontinental railroad route. The railroads were paid a certain amount of money to construct those lines. $16,000 on the level and flatlands, almost 50,000 miles per mile in the mountains. And it also imposed standard gauge, which is 56.5 inches between the rails. That was important because during the Civil War, a lot of railroad companies deliberately had a different gauge so that if they were overtaken, they couldn't be used to transport munitions and troops to other locations. But Lincoln, seeing a conclusion in the future, mandated that all of these rail lines that were going to be beneficiaries of federal money had the same gauge so that they could connect. There's a general misconception that because of the name, the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe Railway Company, that railroad was supposed to build all the way into the city of Santa Fe. That's really not true. One of the provisions of the Pacific Railway Acts was for the railroad company to build in the direction of Santa Fe, leaving the final route and whether or not it went into the city, up to the engineers and the surveyors that were part of the corporate structure. The act also permitted the United States government to extinguish treaties with Native Americans, and Senator Dawes was responsible for passing his act through and dissolving a number of agreements with Native Americans so that the railroad could have right-of-way. And there were a number of accompanying activities for acquisition of Native American land. This is a poster on the right saying, "Get a good home, easy payments, perfect title, no problem. All the land you want is in the West." The federal government and the territorial government essentially worked hand in hand for the development of railroads. This includes coming into the territory of New Mexico. It includes the possible decision of building into Santa Fe. The federal government essentially secured the railroad, its right-of-way, it regulated the railroad, and it protected it. Offsetting that was a territorial government that offered eminent domain to the railroads, offered free use of natural resources and water for the railroads, and forgiveness of taxes. So the railroads were really the beneficiary of a joint effort between the federal government and the territorial government. This is Governor Lew Wallace, who spent a great deal of his time writing while he was governor. But during his administration, there were some territorial laws that were passed as it related to railroads. And these quotes are from territorial laws of New Mexico from 1876. And they deal with the rights and privileges of railroads. I'm not going to read every slide to everyone that's capable of that themselves, but essentially the territorial statutes let the railroads use all the springs of water they wanted for railroading purposes. They could also enter into federal, territorial, and even private property for the necessary construction and maintenance and operation of railroads and railroad lines. Railroads were, as I mentioned before, exempt from territorial taxes. They were exempt from taxation of every kind and description until the expiration of 6 years from and after the completion of the railroad. Most railroad companies didn't pay any taxes with legislation like this behind them. They merely had to document and say that the railroad was not complete and would not be complete for 6 years, and they thereby were exonerated from taxation. It's important to realize the effort that went into construction of rail lines when considering going up the hill from Galisteo Junction, now called Lamy, into Santa Fe. There's a lot of weight involved. There were a lot of hazardous conditions that had to be dealt with. And as you can see from this photograph of rail workers from that period, you came to work with whatever you had on. If it was a white shirt and you didn't have gloves or you didn't have any protective equipment, that's what you did. And the chart on the left side with 11 tons of steel rails, 600 pounds of spike, 3 tons of tie plates, all of those weights is the weight of materials needed for a mile of track. Crews in New Mexico, as well as around the country, were generally grouped by ethnicity. They were largely homogeneous, track gangs were between 80 and 120 people. They were frequently generational, where you would have a grandfather, a father, and the kids all on the same steel gang. These people were used to hard, dangerous work, being outside all day, and they built by the mile, not by the time. If they were told they needed to get 5 miles of track done, when they got 5 miles of track completed is when they quit. A number of them continued on with the railroad into California, into Mexico. A number of other individuals decided just to stay within their general area, and that was all fine with the rail companies. They worked that out. This gives you an idea of what rail growth was like prior to the development of the Lamy Branch. You can see that in the 1870s, it's pretty sparse in New Mexico. It gets more and more built up after that. And then by 1880, there is a significant amount of rail growth in New Mexico, not only from main lines, but from branch lines with your mining organizations, timber railroads, narrow gauges, and a number of others. There were a number of territorial justifications for rail. They were perceived, some of them were practical, and a lot of them were political. The practical justification for rail, generally, was that there was a lot of mining potential in the state, in the territory. The same for logging. Passenger service had an obvious need, as well as agricultural and livestock transport. And the railroad companies also had within their corporate structures town companies whose main purpose was the construction of communities along the route. More importantly, there were political justifications for railroads. The most important one being that New Mexico probably would not achieve statehood until it had a railroad. That was because a railroad made the New Mexico territory and the territorial capital accessible for markets. It made it eligible for federal financial support. It meant new jobs. It meant jobs that people had never even heard of before. There were commercial connections. And also importantly, it made New Mexico look like it was progressive and up there with the other states that had already developed rail services. Statehood had come by 1912, and prior to that, all these other states on the left had railroad services. Texas had it as early as 1853, and Arizona had it just before New Mexico did. But it was very important. This image is a lady preparing the U.S. flag, and New Mexico is awaiting its star to be sewn on the flag. That's from a Harper's Magazine cartoon. There are some very important people that associated with the development of the Lamy Branch Line. Two of them were New Englanders. One of them was a local Santa Fean. I'll just start on the left with Albert Alonzo Robinson. He was a Vermonter, became a civil engineer, and was influential in the development of a number of railroads in the West, becoming president of the Mexican Central Railway himself. His boss, over on the right, was a guy named Thomas Gibson Nickerson. He came from a New England seafaring and whaling family. He was president of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe during the time that people were looking at the possibility of building up to the territorial capital. And he too became the president of a number of railroads. More important locally is the gentleman in the middle by the name of Miguel Antonio Otero. He lived in Santa Fe. He was very influential in both Hispanic and Anglo politics. He was extremely supportive of railroad development and was frequently retained by railroad companies, among them the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, for political advice, for recommendations on a number of issues, all of which were of interest to the railroad. That would include possibilities for mining, logging, timber, natural resource use. Miguel Otero was a significant help for the railroads coming into New Mexico. As a matter of fact, he was given the honor of driving the first spike on the first rail laid in the territory of New Mexico. Let me just start with A.A. Robinson. He was the chief engineer, a New Englander, a friend of Nickerson, the president. He was an attorney, became president of other railroads. And he was asked by Railroad President Nickerson to go to New Mexico and find out what the routes might be like, what the potential for resource development and freight operations were, and a number of other issues, and to report back to him. He did that. He made some recommendations to the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, and his recommendations were to bypass Santa Fe, advance on toward Rincon, Mexico, and California. His journal from his trip in 1875 to New Mexico makes a fascinating read. And among other things, he says, all of the modes of life in New Mexico are primitive. The wooden plow is still being used. He says, among these people, to depart from the usage of their grandfathers is sacrilegious. And finally, he says, Santa Fe is a place of no commercial importance, and it's sustained by political patronage. Some things change and some don't, I suppose. But he was saying, and also made recommendations to Nickerson, that the proper route into New Mexico from Colorado lies on the east side of the Spanish Mountains, the Sangre de Cristos, through Anton Chico, which is just south of Las Vegas, New Mexico, then through Canyon Blanco, the Galisteo River, and finally into the Rio Grande. You can see what he's talking about. These are the Spanish peaks, and he's talking about going down this way and then coming in towards Socorro, and there at Rincon, the line would split, with one leg going into the Republic of Mexico for connection with Mexican National Railway development at the same time, the other leg going due west into Deming, which formed the Second Transcontinental Railroad in 1881, and then on into California so they could hook into freight and the Southern Pacific market there. In Santa Fe, there was a committee established at the time of Robinson's report, and during the time that New Mexico was a goal for the Santa Fe Railway Company. These 14 individuals were part of a citizens committee to convince the railroad that it needed to either build the main line directly to the capital city, or at least to build a branch line. And some of these names may be familiar to people that have lived here for a while. We have some streets and schools and locations in Santa Fe named after these gentlemen, or some of them. There was A.A. Staub. There's a Staub House in New Mexico. There's a Manderfield Elementary, at least there was. There's a Gildersleeve Street. Henry Waldo was a Supreme Court justice, the community of Waldo named after him, and a number of other people. There's the Spiegelberg brothers and Archbishop LeMay himself. Nickerson offered the committee some choices after listening to their approach and recognizing that there were a number of people that were serious about building a railroad and making it come to the to the territorial capital. The first thing that he mentioned and suggested was that if Santa Fe will donate $175,000 and depot grounds, we'll build the railroad and we'll operate it. The second was that if the community of Santa Fe, and by the community, I mean the city and the county, will build the road at reasonable cost to the satisfaction of A.A. Robinson, our chief engineer, we'll furnish the rolling stock and we'll operate it in conjunction with our main line. The third choice that Nickerson gives the committee is that Santa Fe can organize its own company, build and operate it on its own account, and our company will or may not agree to do business on terms. The committee, rather than offering up $175,000, passed two local bonds totaling $150,000. The railroad accepted it nonetheless, and on Valentine's Day of 1880, this article appeared in the Santa Fe New Mexican, and it's worth quoting that the headlines say that the last link is forged in the iron chain which binds the ancient city to the United States, and the old Santa Fe Trail passes into oblivion. There were speeches. There was a Buffalo Soldier unit of the 9th Cavalry Band marching around the plaza. Everyone was delirious with the fact that Santa Fe and New Mexico was finally moving into the 19th century. The last spike was hammered down by Lew Wallace, and things were looking good. Even though the article came out on the 14th of February, the railroad actually arrived on the 19th, and that is a photograph of the locomotives that came into the territory. This is what the territorial flag looked like in 1912, and it was created in 1911, so we only had a territorial flag for a very short period of time before it transitioned into the well-known Zia symbol. Normally, when I'm giving this presentation, I take a break for 10 minutes, but I think we can move along. Hopefully that's okay, unless I hear differently from somebody. I want to give you an idea of other railroads that were operating in and around Santa Fe around the time that the Santa Fe branch line was built. And there were a number of them. The first one that was built after the arrival of the ATSF via the branch line was the Santa Fe Central, and that is the blue line. It essentially left from Tomasita's station, Tomasita's restaurant. It was known as Union Station because it was shared by the Chile line, which is the green line on the right, and the blue line, which is the Santa Fe Central, which later became the New Mexico Central Railroad, which eventually became the New Mexico Central Railway, which eventually became an Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line because it bought it up in the late 1970s. But there was this line, and the blue line with the New Mexico Central was important because it went all the way down from Santa Fe through Kennedy, Moriarty, Estancia, and Willard, where it finally hooked up with the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific, making it possible for a passenger getting on in Santa Fe to go literally anywhere in the country. The other line that's important certainly is the Chile line. That also shared Tomasita's station and went north and tied into the Denver and Rio Grande at that point. The other line is the main line, which is the yellow one. So you can see there was a significant amount of railroading activity going on. may be interesting to point out that over the course of the 1880s up until 2020, last year, there were 3 Santa Fe Southern Railway companies. The first Santa Fe Southern ran from Espanola to Santa Fe, taking over the former trackage of another line. And I won't get into all the names because it does get confusing, but that was the first one. When the branch line was abandoned in the 1990s, it was again named Santa Fe Southern and makes the second Santa Fe Southern Railroad. And it was recently repurchased in 2020 and retained the name Santa Fe Southern Railway Company with a different board of directors. So legally and fiscally, there were 3 Santa Fe Southern Railway companies in this area. This is a pass from the Santa Fe Southern Railway Company, and that is something that I think is worth noting, principally because when the railroads were trying to be attracted into New Mexico by influential legislators and city fathers, railroad passes were given out to people that had some influence. After the Progressive era and Teddy Roosevelt's trust busting, the attitude of the federal government began to change, and these railroad passes were outlawed, and that outlawing of railroad passes remains in the New Mexico Constitution today. There were a number of structures that the railroad built as it came through, and this would be the era of the Fred Harvey hotels. A number of them were built in New Mexico. I've bolded the name Rincon. Some of you may not know where that is, but if you've driven to Las Cruces, about 30 miles before you arrive in Las Cruces, there's an exit for Rincon. And Rincon is the location that A.A. Robinson was urging his boss to get to and to bypass Santa Fe, because that was the place where the railroad would split. The west leg going into Deming, forming the second transcontinental railroad, and going straight would take you into El Paso and connections with freight markets from the Republic of Mexico. These are just a couple of, it's a few Harvey hotels in New Mexico. On the upper right is the Castañeda in Las Vegas, recently rehabilitated and an absolute delight to stay in. There is the depot at Rincon on the right side in the center of the photograph. The other side, the left bottom, is the El Navajo Hotel in Gallup, and that was reestablished as a transportation intermodal facility where Amtrak stops, intercity bus has exchanges there, and a number of other locations. I had an opportunity to look at the blueprints for the El Navajo Hotel in Gallup, and it was interesting to note that there were 3 waiting rooms. There was a Anglo waiting room, there was a Hispanic waiting room, there was a women's waiting room, all separate. And even though it is as close as you can get to the Navajo Nation, there were no facilities for the Navajos, the assumption being Navajo people and other Native Americans probably weren't even allowed in the building when it was first built. This is what some of the blueprints looked like for some of these hotels, but there were some important structures built that were part and parcel of the Lamy Branch Line. They were the El Ortiz Hotel itself, the ATSF depot that's in the rail yards in downtown Santa Fe today. There was a Lamy depot that is still standing. There was a Union depot, which is Tomasita's, and there was a depot called Kennedy, and I'll talk about those very briefly. The LRT's Harvey Hotel was destroyed in the 1940s by fire. It had been in existence for more than 30 years. It was a small boutique-like Harvey Hotel, very well thought of. A number of people shortened their trips or discontinued it just in order to stay a little bit longer at the LRTs. It was designed internally by Mary Coulter, whose handprint is obvious on a number of New Mexico structures. It was small, but very well liked. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Depot is on the north end of the Lamy Branch Line, and it replaced a wooden structure that was there from 1880 when the line was first built. It had passenger service from the 1900s until almost the 1930s, and thereafter a bus company called the Clarkson Bus Company in Santa Fe took people to Lamy. The depot has been acquired by the city of Santa Fe that evicted the Santa Fe Southern from use of that building back in the 90s. And as you can see, the structure is slowly deteriorating, and hopefully that can be halted. This is known locally as Tomasita's Restaurant, but it's also historically known as Union Depot. Trains from the Chile line would come to the north end, unload passengers and freight there, and the Santa Fe Central, later called the New Mexico Central, operated out of the south end of the building. It was built in 1906 and was jointly used by those two railroads. This is the Lamy Depot. On the left is an older image of it from the earlier 1900s, and as you can see, it at one time had a tower so that the station agent could see trains arriving and departing from different ends of it. And this is what the depot looks like with an open passenger seating area on the east end of the structure, and it's being refurbished, and it's owned by the new Santa Fe Southern Railway Company, which leases space to Amtrak. There's another depot that is off the Lamy Branch Line, but it has potential and it relates to it historically. There's a location on the main line of the Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe, or the Burlington Northern today, known as Kennedy. This was the depot at Kennedy, and that was significant because it is where the New Mexico Central line and the ATSF line crossed. That line was very important for a number of years for the transportation of agricultural and livestock shipment, as well as passenger. There were mixed trains on that line for almost 50 years. The depot was disassembled, moved up to its present location, served as a ranch headquarters for a while, and is presently now the community center for the community of El Dorado. Between 1930 and 1960, the branch was very active with tourists, with movie stars, with people wanting to come out and see what the Wild West was like. These Packards and Cadillacs would pick people up at the Lamy Depot, and there would be tours, Indian detours, of the pueblos and of sites and things to see in northern New Mexico through the Fred Harvey system. These were the Harvey girls, and there were some increase in freight by 1935. Santa Fe was becoming a known tourist destination. So the Harvey system and all that it had to offer travelers was very popular. By that time, the Lamy Branch had 22 freight shippers. There was a significant amount of inbound and outbound traffic, from manufactured goods to raw materials for all kinds of things that were being used in Santa Fe. This is in the 1930s and 40s, after the war. It really brought an end to the great trains of the past, the Santa Fe Chief, the El Capitan, the Super Chief, and even the Grand Canyon line. This is a 1964 timetable on the left, and that's an image on the lower part of the screen of the El Capitan moving through southern Santa Fe County. World War II was very important in terms of the Lamy Branch. Most of you know there was a Japanese internment camp at near Casa Salon off of Alameda Road in Santa Fe. Those men were transported to that internment camp via the Lamy Branch Line and remained there for a number of years. There's a lot of posters urging civilians not to be taking space up on a train. If soldiers were trying to get back from leave or try to be going on leave, they needed the space. There were also a number of United States Army hospital cars that utilized the Lamy Branch Line in order to get up to the Bruns Army Hospital. This is an aerial photograph of the Y leading into and out of Bruns Army Hospital. The Army Hospital was located over where the old College of Santa Fe used to be and where the University of Art and Design now is, just off of St. Michael's Drive. And this is a Google shot of that. Across the top is St. Michael's Drive, and in the center of the picture is a Y, and that was used by trains coming up from Lamy to go into the hospital, and for trains turning around after they had been in Santa Fe, either for freight or other activities. But that Y leading to the hospital is still in place and stands out from aerial photographs. Bruns Army Hospital was only in place for about 3 years, but it employed a lot of people. It infused about $5 million into the local economy. It had 2,500 beds, and it was visited by Hollywood stars for people that were recuperating there, including Groucho Marx, Helen Keller, Bob Hope, and a number of other people. Women and ladies working for the railroad became more of a necessity than it ever had been during the World War and in the 1940s. The group of ladies on the right are from Santa Fe Railway System operating in the Carlsbad area, the potash mines, and those women were used to get in the hoppers that had dumped out potash, fertilizer, herbicides, and other nasty kinds of products, jump in the hoppers and sweep them out with brooms and dustpans. The protection they were given were goggles, and that's what they have. And all of these images, let me just say, are on display at the New Mexico History Museum downtown off the plaza in a display called Working for the Railroad. I wasn't sure I had the name, but that's what it is. It's called Working for the Railroad, and it depicts all the people that were, in reality, the wind beneath the wings of Fred Harvey, of the famous trains, of the food service, of the hotels. And that photo display not only shows female railroad employees, but Native Americans, Asian people, and a number of others that worked for the railroad companies, kept them running during the wartime. After the war, things really changed for railroads generally, and it led to, eventually, the filing of abandonment and closure of the Lamy Line by 1990. So by the 1950s, Americans had discovered the family auto for vacations. In the 60s, you have the end of the great trains, the El Capitan, the Super Chief, the names that are very familiar in the streamliners were going out of business. There were bankruptcies by the 1970s and the disappearance of the New York Central, the Pennsylvania Central, the Chicago, Rock Island and Pacific, and a number of others, the Missouri Pacific. Railroad management by the 80s was desperately trying to cut their costs. They were closing a number of depots. They were abandoning branch lines. There was even an effort, a successful effort, to eliminate cabooses, and that was tied to railway labor employment. Management said that that cabooses were not needed, and they could be replaced, and they were. And today, there are probably more cabooses at fast food restaurants and chambers of commerce than there are on any rail system. In the 1990s, crew numbers were changed. There used to be 4 to 6 men on a freight railroad. This was reduced to 2, and that was subsequently reduced to 1 in some instances. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, owner of the Lamy Branch, was in trouble. It tried to merge with other railroad companies. The Interstate Commerce Commission, now known as the Surface Transportation Board, forbid some of those mergers, and the railroad was forced to do something to cut its financial hemorrhaging. There were also a number of other things happening in the 1990s that made it even more difficult for the once famous Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway Company and its branch line into Santa Fe. There were national strikes. There were large accidents happening all over the country for a variety of reasons. Mergers were being denied by the Interstate Commerce Commission, and there was a very restrictive regulatory atmosphere for railroad companies. The picture on the lower right shows workers from the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers striking in Santa Fe at that time. In May of 1991, an abandonment poster, the one on the right, was nailed to the door of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway Depot in the rail yards. The Railroad Bureau of the State Transportation Department at that time initiated a study to look at the engineering and economic viability of the Lamy Branch Line so that it might be useful in promoting that line to private operators that might be able to buy it and preserve the line at least until another company might show interest in it. So the study that the state did was exhaustive in terms of what needed to be done, what the fees would be, what the attractiveness might be for potential shippers and purchasers. A lot of information was gathered on that. And as I say, it was geared toward the prevention of the abandonment of the line. If the line legally is abandoned, that sets in place an entire regulatory process where things and files and reports need to be filed and sent to federal agencies in a very precise manner, all attached to a timeline. So once the abandonment process starts, it's difficult to stop it. The major drawback of abandoning the line, in addition to losing the service for the shippers, is that the right-of-way would revert back to adjacent landowners, and it would therefore become almost impossible to reassemble it again if a group or an individual came forward and needed to buy up each parcel in order to make a complete line all the way from Lamy up to Santa Fe. So there was a lot of concern about that. In August of 1991, this special business train pulled into the yards in Santa Fe. And aboard that train were executives from the real estate office of the ATSF, people from the executive department. There were a number of attorneys. There were a number of other individuals representing the railroad. There was a public meeting held on the Lamy Branch and its fate at the State Land Office Auditorium on August 5th of 1991. The entire purpose to discuss the railroad's point of view and perspective on why it needed to get rid of the line, to provide an opportunity for those interested in possibly purchasing it to step forward. And there were a number of attendees. The other reason was that this was essentially the formal goodbye of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway Company to its namesake city, a relation that had begun 111 years ago. It would be the last time that Santa Fe Railway executives would visit the city in a railroading capacity. There were a number of people at that meeting at the state land office representing state agencies, the county and city reps, the legislators, Lamy residents, El Dorado residents, a number of people. Finally, in 1992, there was a group of people that stepped forward, were able to scrape up enough money to purchase the line. The Santa Fe Railway Company agreed to it. They began with a locomotive. They even lent the group a locomotive engineer to get them started. And the new Santa Fe Southern Railway, born in 1992, began hauling some freight. They did beer from the Coors distributorship near Sawmill Road. They were hauling decorative rock, National Guard vehicles. They were looking at a number of excursion ideas, evening stargazing trips, retirement party. I had my retirement party on the Santa Fe Southern. So it's particularly memorable, but there were caboose rides, events for kids, all kinds of things, man. They were really trying to be creative to get local and regional interest in the Santa Fe Southern line. And there were good times and there were bad times for the Santa Fe Southern. Everybody associated with that line worked very hard to maintain it and to sustain it. But these are just some of the school groups and the retirement parties and excursion takers that enjoyed the scenery overlooking the Galisteo Basin and enjoying themselves in Lamy and on the way back. Things began to get really tough in the 1980s and the 1990s for the Santa Fe Southern Railway Company. That little company that started with the idea of saving the Lamy Branch Line and having it turned over from the ATSF to them was beset with all kinds of problems, from the Federal Railroad Administration regulations for locomotive and track maintenance and safety, the city of Santa Fe dealing with acquisition of the rail yards and development of it. The Trust for Public Land was looking for and eventually succeeded in having a trail adjacent to the line. When Bill Richardson came in, there were demands from the governor's office for acquisition and use of the line into Santa Fe. There were all kinds of issues with Amtrak, with Burlington Northern Santa Fe, the city, the county. And finally, an outfit called STI Global Australia bought the Santa Fe Southern system and was a majority stockholder. STI Global was a safety testing organization out of Australia and wanted to use something that they had called the Golden Triangle that consisted of the main line, the Lamy Branch Line, and another line. There's three different types of track where safety systems could be tested. There were a number of other problems happening during this time with the Santa Fe Southern. There were track problems, there were maintenance issues, grade crossing problems. The depot was deteriorating, and the railroad itself was evicted from using it. There were operating issues, such as dealing with the New Mexico Rail Runner Express, trail issues. Tomasitas parking lot was a difficult issue in terms of taking up parking space for the railroad. The railroad wanted more spaces, and that was a controversy that lasted for a long time. Plus, there was a lot of political issues going on as well at the time in terms of federal and state laws. There was local legislation, partnerships. It became overwhelming for the leadership of the Santa Fe Southern in the 1990s. There's a plaque in the city rail yard, and it recognizes people like Carol Raymond, Bob Sarr, and others who took risks to preserve this active rail line into Santa Fe, and with private money, time, and passion came together to bring the railroad into fruition. During this difficult time, one of the locomotives of the Santa Fe Southern sat vacant in Lamy, and I thought it was a symbolic image. As I said, the Santa Fe Southern was repurchased again in May of 2020, and there were headlines about local trio buying the Santa Fe Southern Railway Company, and there are a lot of plans for its development. The three owners that were mentioned in the newspaper article were Catherine Oppenheimer of the National Dance Institute, George Railroad Martin, R.R. Martin, novelist and screenwriter, and certainly Bill Banowski, owner of the Violet Crown Cinema. These are two shots of the Santa Fe Southern. I am not an employee of, neither do I speak for, the Santa Fe Southern Railway Company, but I can give you a very broad idea of where that might be going. The organizational structure, as I understand it, is really triangular. There is a Santa Fe Railway Company that is the holding company of the new Santa Fe Southern Railway. There is the Santa Fe Southern Railway Common Carrier element, regulated by the Federal Railroad Administration for the transport of a variety of kinds of freight. And then there is Sky Railway, which is the excursion and fun part of the railroad, if I can say that. But Sky Railway would be the element concerned with excursions, nighttime viewing of stars and celestial activities. There could be a gourmet train. There would even be the possibility of Wild West shoot 'em up trains where bandits would stop the train and get on board. Certainly birthday parties for young kids and retirement parties for people that are interested in just having a great time on a train in a beautiful environment. There are some plans for dinner trains, various excursion trips, and also something with a vehicle called Rail Explorers that are pedal vehicles used throughout the country. And Rail Explorers is a company that was looking at the Lamy line and entertaining the idea of having some of its vehicles available for people. And these are shots of rail explorers in different parts of the country, and the people seem to be having a really nice time using that. That really concludes the history of the Lamy Branch Line, and I'd be happy to answer any questions and hope I haven't droned on too long.
Thanks so much, Fred. That's fantastic. That was such a great presentation. One of the first questions that we had pop up was the very first photograph that's in your slide presentation. Someone was asking where that photograph was taken.
Yes. Yeah.
Slide 1.
There's a place in Santa Fe, and most people know it as Doctor's Hospital, and that is, let me see, that's where this is located. And the reason that this is a significant photograph is that it shows the Santa Fe branch line with its oak wooden ties, rail that's jointed together with joint bars every 39 feet, going off into the distance. The line on the right is the rail runner. It has concrete ties, extremely heavy rail. It's electronically signaled. It's possible at this location to literally put one foot in the 19th century and the other in 21st. It's an amazing location. And where that spot is at a place called the Doctor's Hospital. You're on Sawmill Road, and you just keep going all the way past the intersection of Rodeo, and it's right in there. You'd see it, and there's a parking space.
Good, thanks.
And let me just add one other thing quickly.
Of course.
On either one of these lines, since they're active railroads, you've got to be careful. Beyond that, if you are on either one of these lines, you're trespassing because they are both private property.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's good to know. Someone asked very early on too, what is a fish plate?
A fish plate is, can you see my arrow when I wiggle it on the screen?
Yes.
Okay. A fish plate is a bar of metal with holes in it that's used to join pieces of rail together, like the one you can see on the Lamy Branch right here. The modern railroad systems don't use these anymore. They weld all these rails. These rails come in quarter-mile lengths, and then they're welded together. It makes for a much smoother ride, and it also prevents the clickety-clack of railroading from bygone days, with the wheels hitting that joint and wearing it down.
Okay. And someone asked if we could post your email address. Is that something you would be willing to share?
Sure.
Okay, I can put that if anyone wants to, well, we can put it in the chat here too, but I can also put it on the page on the website for the for your talk. But what is your email address?
It's nmtrans.plan@AOL.com. It stands for New Mexico Transportation Planning, but again, it's nmtransplan@AOL.com.
Transplan@AOL.com. Okay, I think I've got it correct there. And then someone said that the history museum's working on the railroad exhibits to make it available for free online too. So the exhibit that you referenced when you were showing the women workers. And then we have another question. As I recall, the August 1991 visit by the super chief was in conjunction with the art museum exhibition of the ATSF artwork. Several excursions from Santa Fe to Lamy were held. Some active people circulated petitions opposing the abandonment, which resulted in a much larger audience at the hearing than would otherwise have been attended.
If anyone is familiar with that activity or participated in it in 1991, I would very much like to communicate with them. So by all means, please write me at my email.
Okay, so Philip, if you want to, if you're still there, we have the email. I put his email up in the chat box too, so you can access it there. And someone had raised their hand, but we are only taking questions in the chat box. So if you want to post a question there quickly, I'm happy to read that out. We're not turning on microphones or speakers. I mean, sorry, microphones or cameras right now. So I just have one quick, well, I do have a few quick questions, but why were in the 1990s, why was the legislation so restrictive? What happened at that point?
Could you say that again?
In the 1990s, you said the legislation with trains was getting much more restrictive. What caused that?
Like so many other issues, the pendulum for federal regulatory issues swings back and forth from leniency to tightening up issues. But in the 1990s, a lot of railroad companies were trying to merge, and the Interstate Commerce Commission's response was that if enough of these large companies got together and formed a coalition, that it would be impossible for shippers to have any flexibility in rates, and the shippers themselves would end up being captive to huge corporate organizations. So there was a general reluctance on the part of the regulatory agencies to permit mergers. And that's one reason that the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe did not survive. It was prohibited for merging with the Southern Pacific and a number of other attempts that it tried to make. Finally, it merged with the Burlington Northern, and it's useful.
Well, you're getting lots of thank yous. I do have one last question that I will ask from one of our participants, and it's, what's the future for diesel locomotives?
Diesel. It's certainly better than coal or steam, but I'm not sure where that's going to go. I think most of the future operations that I've read about or been familiar with is that the industry is going towards electric and possibly diesel electric locomotives.
So there you are getting lots of compliments, especially you have a one little thing I'll read, which will be a good final note, but there's someone who currently works at the New Mexico DOT Rail Bureau, and they got an email from us, and maybe it was shared around. And several of them have attended, and they're incredibly grateful for the talk. And she also says, I thoroughly enjoyed the talk and appreciate Fred mentioning the trespassing and fouling the tracks.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for that. I guess your background and experience have kind of helped to warn people about things like that as well. So
there's a trail that goes all the way down. You can stay on that.
Yeah, exactly. Like the rail trail. There you go.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Fred. That was fantastic. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm sure that there's a lot of people who really did. So thank you so much. And I'll post your email as well on that page and leave the link for the page under our events up for maybe a few more days. And as soon as I can put the video on the YouTube